Okay, we talked about the state-on-state aspect. When cyber law comes down to focus on individuals and civil liberties, this is where things get sometimes quite hazy. Now, obviously, the day's news has been covered with the story of this 19-year-old British teenager who's been apprehended for the attack on the Pentagon database.
On the suspicion of the
suspicion,
alleged attack.
yes. So get my legal terminology
Yes.
correct. When we look at his particular case, and we know that the U.S. justice system is at the moment looking at ramping up its minimum punishments for cyber crimes, what can we expect to happen with this young man in terms of extradition, in terms of being tried here in the UK or the US, in terms of punishment? How do we determine these things?
Right. At this stage, we know very, very little about it, and having been as an expert witness on the inside of some of these cases, sometimes for the prosecution, more often for the defence within the English legal system, I'm rather reluctant to sort of talk about this specific individual. In general terms, the current policy here in the UK, and that follows from the Gary McKinnon case, is if somebody hacks from the United Kingdom into an overseas computer for a country with which we are friendly, there's a strong likelihood that you will be extradited. And that's partly because the law exists to enable them to do so, but also if you're going to bring somebody into the English courts, but you're relying on expensive evidence from overseas, then you're worried about the cost of sending your police officers. There are going to be problems with what's called disclosure, particularly if people have gone into sensitive computers, and a lot of legal arguments that can be thrown around it. And I've been involved in those cases.
And the Gary McKinnon case.
Well, I've been involved in the Gary McKinnon, but the Gary McKinnon case has been done largely on extradition and on the fact that he has Asperger's. But I did a large software piracy case with an international group. They were prosecuted here. Most of the evidence came from the States, and that was one of the most expensive cases ever before the courts, simply because of the arguments the defence were able to put. And following on from that, that's why the CPS is saying if there's been a UK computer which has been attacked, then we will prosecute for that. But otherwise, we'll probably, let the extradition process go forward. Now, if we look at the current case, about which we know very little, but we know there have been UK targets as well. So there may be a choice to prosecute them there. And also, because the Gary McKinnon case hasn't, as it were, worked out terribly well politically, there may now be pressure on them they're going to mount charges not to extradite. The whole extradition treaty thing between the UK and the US has got rather controversial and difficult.
Certainly the US would want to get their legal hands on this individual.
I'm pretty sure they would. I think there's something else to be said more generally about levels of punishment. There are people who seem to think that the main solution to hacking or this broader area of cybersecurity is more and more police and tougher punishment. My own view is that a lot of these people a lot of the hackers are only successful because computer security is tragically weak. Again, if we look at some of the recent claims by Lulsec, and they produce some detail of what they've done, some of these exploits really should not have happened. They shouldn't have been successful, just that people are very sloppy. So one takes, say, as an analogy, if you leave your laptop, your expensive laptop, and your briefcase in your unlocked car, it doesn't make the thief a good person. He's not doing you a favour. On the other hand, the immediate solution is not more punishment for the thief and more policemen on the street. The immediate solution is don't leave your laptop and your computer in your unlocked car. So there is an element of that. And I also think some of the victims of hacking go in for what I call distraction. They've actually fallen down on their job. So they build up the skill of the hacker in order to show what a difficult job they had.
Do you think that's something that they could bring to their defence? Would that really stand up in court?
I don't think it's a defence. I mean, the same way I don't think it's a defence for the thief who steals from your car. It's not a defence, but it does make you look at the victim and decide how sympathetic you're going to be. And in particular, they're asking the taxpayer to subsidise their carelessness. You put people in prison for a long time. It costs to keep people in prison. You want more police officers. It costs to have police officers.
Is there a perception that maybe people might look more kindly on cyber criminals because they're not outwardly threatening or carrying weapons?
Well, there are lots of different categories of cyber criminals. You have the recreational hacker, which is what we've just been talking about, someone who's showing off and may cause quite a lot of harm which they don't intend. You have the hacktivist who is using the same techniques.
Hacker activist.
Yes, but I mean, essentially, they have some ideological aim. They want, they could be Greenpeace, hanging a banner from a prominent building. Instead, they're doing something else. Their aims are more or less the same. You then have people who are out and out criminals. They're operating in the cyber domain because 3/4 of us use computers in our homes, and that's where the opportunities are. You obviously have industrial spies, and you have various uses by various agencies of the state. They all use similar techniques. Their motivations are rather different. So to come back to your question about sort of sympathy, I'm not suggesting you have any particular sympathy for them. You may feel in the case of Gary McKinnon, in all the circumstances, he's having a rougher deal than is entirely justified. Don't particularly want to get into that argument, not the least because I'm professionally involved and know a little bit more about the case. And if by any chance he does get tried in the courts, my duty will be to the court, and I don't want anything on tape which is suggesting, that I'm in any way a campaigner of it. But I think most people would feel some element of sympathy for the position he is in. And similarly, there is another individual just at the moment who put up a website providing links to other locations where you could download copyright material, and he is being heavily threatened at the moment, and I would think most people feel that is a wholly inappropriate use of oppressive state power. There are other people, major criminal gangs, and you really do want them punished, I think.
Is there a risk, do you think, that because some of these crimes are in a way committed behind the closed doors of the cyber community, and in a way they're slightly anonymous, is there a risk that some of these people could be prosecuted slightly behind closed doors, out of the public eye, or in some way?
No, it's not possible to prosecute people outside the public eye. You have to go into the open criminal court. Even
if it were, say, a military issue tried in a military court?
I suppose that's a possibility. We haven't had any sort of instance, it seemed to me, which come close to it.
The Pentagon hacking, would that not perhaps qualify, since it's a U.S. government installation, a military installation?
Well, I think you could probably try that more or less in open court. You might have to have some of the elements of it redacted, but I think there'd be a strong pressure from the judges of most countries that it is important that justice is seen to be done. I mean, you can see the considerable anxiety over the Guantanamo Bay people, a feeling that military courts, they may not necessarily be the best way to go. It might please some people, but on the other hand, you may also be creating martyrs. So it's not an easy decision to make. Overwhelmingly, I think most lawyers and most members of the public would prefer to see justice openly administered. We do that with official secrets cases as well. It may have to be an element of redaction.
How has WikiLeaks changed the notion of cyber law and what we deem as appropriate versus inappropriate versus illegal activity?
I keep on coming back to this problem of there is the law and then there is collecting the evidence and enforcing the law. So what WikiLeaks have done is to take information which is considered private, and they have found a mechanism for publishing it. Obviously, there are individuals who have been particularly identified with it, Julian Assange, for example, but the charges he is facing at the moment are actually nothing to do with WikiLeaks itself. Maybe a suspicion that the two are actually linked.
Quite a bit of suspicion, I think.
Yeah, as you say, quite a bit of suspicion, but overtly that isn't the case. I take a rather broader view, which is that the existence of the internet, whether you call it WikiLeaks or whatever, it just makes for easier open communication, and all states of whatever complexion need to understand that. And obviously there are circumstances in which we in the West approve of what's going on. We're delighted when various countries in Arabia and sort of North Africa seem to free themselves of their yoke. We're delighted if it would happen in Burma and a number of other places, and then we don't like it when it might be happening to aspects of our own government. The fact is the technology in this respect is relatively neutral, and it creates new opportunities. And the danger for states is that they may not be able to control the process. The people who have this material take on themselves a huge responsibility. I mean, they will say, we're doing this because there is stuff which the public really need to know about because they're otherwise voting for the wrong sorts of things. On the other hand, who is to tell whether what you are revealing is probably in your best interest, only you don't realize it. To that extent, I think nation states and governments have just become weaker, and you can pass all the laws you like, you might pick up individuals and punish them, but it probably won't help in the long run. So again, if we look at WikiLeaks, person at the moment most people have in mind is Bradley Manning, and there is a general view, again, we don't know precisely what the evidence is that he's being singled out and the approach of the US authorities is quote-unquote excessive. A bit difficult to judge from the outside. But as I said, I think there is an overall problem, and governments will have to change their approach to things in ways that they hadn't perhaps thought was going to be necessary.
Do you think maybe this is an area where international law could come into, and we talked about international observance of regulations?
I don't think this is the domain of law. You can certainly pass laws. This is just a sort of a fact of life. If you can't, you can pass a law, but if you can't enforce it, you still have got to adjust your behaviour accordingly, and you will catch some people, but a lot of people you will not catch. And if you go after people, then you may be even spurring others to release even more information because they take a particular ideological position. As I said, I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I read law at university. I spend a lot of time among lawyers, and that leads me to understand that law can do quite a lot of things, but there are definite limits to what you can do, and simply passing legislation doesn't actually solve the problem and may indeed make things worse.
Do you think perhaps some of this legislation would be a threat to civil liberty?
I think there's always a danger with any security legislation where it starts out with one aim, but you end up by collecting a lot of information about individuals. You give more power to the police or the security and intelligence agencies than you intend. Now, I know a lot of people in the police and in the security and intelligence agencies, and all of them seem to be hard-working, public-spirited individuals. But on the other hand, we know historically that if you give the agencies the power, at some point along the line, it is going to get abused. You then have to ask yourself, what is the audit mechanism? And that can look a little bit flaky. So that's the reason for thinking quite carefully, why do we need to give people all this additional power? Is it actually going to be beneficial? And it's important that we have that debate in societies that we like to think of as open. And all too often what happens is the legislation gets passed in a hurry in the immediate aftermath of some sort of event, and we regret it later on. And that, I think, has happened with a number of bits of legislation here in the UK.